All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back with the Louis B. Free Radio Show, Brain Food from the Heartland. One of my favorite human beings is our guest, and Gregory Copley, president of the International Strategic Studies Association in Washington, D.C., and author of how many books now, Gregory?
Only 36.
36 books. I just, with all you do with ISSA and everything, I don't know how you obviously are very good at time management, I guess is what I need to say, right?
Well, basically, Louis, it's about I can't think until I write. So, and I can write faster than I can think. So that's a great advantage in my business.
Wow. Working on anything? I who haven't written any books shouldn't be asking, are you working on anything new now?
Well, I'm always working on something new, and there are a couple that look like developing into book length studies. One is about the role of monarchies in stabilizing societies in troubled times, because we see a lot of examples of how the crown in any country can be a great stabilizing factor, well above politics and the like, so that it enables societies to have a lot of freedoms of speech, freedoms of political expression and the like, without losing the continuity of governance and the continuity of national identity.
Let's let's talk about the UK and the transition. People that I know, actually people in the States also, were very fond of the Queen. People that I know in the UK are just, I think around the world, people admired her and were pretty devastated when they learned of her passing. What's the transition going to be like?
Well, all transitions are difficult. And one of the advantages of the way that the British evolved the system of transition between crowns intergenerationally has been actually the guarantor of British success, economic continuity, the growth of Britain as a global power and the like. And my family came over from Normandy to England with William the Conqueror in 1066. In fact, one of my ancestors was the military commander of that exercise, Roger de Montgomery, who was a Count of Alençon in France and had a Norman county as well. But he led the battle and was supposed to go back as regent of Normandy, but in fact stayed in Britain and to help quell the Welsh. But when Roger de Montgomery, my ancestor, died, and then when William the Conqueror, King William, died, there was no established procedure for the transfer of power to the next generation. So my ancestors, the son of Roger de Montgomery, backed the wrong successor. And as a result, we lost all of our fortune and titles, had to buy them back. Then the next generation did the same thing. And it was only after about the third generation that we saw Britain evolve this transition process of primogeniture, which would guarantee that you knew who the next monarch was going to be. And that process has been refined down the generations. But essentially, what you get is a seamless transition. Everyone knows the expression, the king is dead, long live the king, or in this case, lately, the Queen is dead, long live the king. And that actually helps to assure people that there's going to be a continuity of procedure, of style, and if you like, overarching governance. And because the crown represents, if you like, the protection of the Constitution, the protection of the people against the predations of government. And so seeing King Charles come in is interesting because he, as Prince of Wales, he had a lot of free expressions about ecology, about the environment, about architecture, and all sorts of things. And he made it clear, look, I can say this while I'm the Prince of Wales, essentially the Crown Prince, but when I'm king, I can't say anything. And that's exactly what happened. And so there's this confusion. Will the king be controversial? because we know what he was like in his long tenure as Prince of Wales. And the answer is yes, you know how he'll be. He will be above politics. He will not interfere, whether it's on environmental issues or on anything else. He will merely, if you like, administer the protection of the Constitution and make sure that Parliament abides by its constitutional responsibilities. And that applies also to the dominions and realms, for example, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand in particular. And in Australia, there was an instance during the 1980s when the Governor General representing the Crown dismissed the government of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam because the Prime Minister had abrogated the Constitution. He was supposed to resign if he couldn't get his budget financed through the House and the Senate, and the Prime Minister refused to resign. So the Governor General, acting on behalf of the Queen, dismissed him and called new elections. So basically, the Crown is there to protect the public from rogue politicians. And that's very important. And it acts as a dampening and a moderating effect, so that really there's hardly ever a need for the Crown to intervene directly, as happened in Australia that time in the 80s. But the influence is there, so that everyone knows that there are limits to their social behavior, that they can't abrogate the Constitution, that they have to abide by norms of civilized behavior. And that's essentially prevailed in Britain and in the Commonwealth countries since that time. So really, the passing of Queen Elizabeth and the accession of King Charles III is quite significant, largely because, as you say, we've all grown up with the presence of Queen Elizabeth, and it was a comforting presence and a stabilizing presence. And now we see Britain going into a new era, a new king, a new prime minister. It's out of the European Union. It is back to its traditional role as a global trading nation, and that's what the new government wants, and that's what the people want. So it's going to be a very interesting time for not just for Britain, but for the global balance of power, particularly at a time when the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia have joined in this AUKUS, Australia, UK, US strategic pact to extend the role of the maritime powers in containing the expansionism of the People's Republic of China. And of course, since that time, we've seen the world go back into a polarized condition. So you have now this new Eurasian bloc of the People's Republic of China, Russia, North Korea, Belarus, Iran, and Turkey, which is supposed to be part of NATO, but working against the West. And so if you like, the return of Britain to being a global strategic power is critical to how we all maintain, if you like, some of the values of Western civilization. We all know that Western civilization is going through a major transformation. The question is, how much of the values of Western civilization do we wish to maintain, and how do we intend to ensure that we maintain those values? I'm not sure we're going about it the right way, because we keep shooting ourselves in the foot, and we keep, if you like, going on a much more materialistic and transactional bent in our lives, and we forget about long-term values. We think more about economics than we do about values, and so on. So we have to make some decisions.
We think more about economics than we do values. I'm talking with Gregory Copley. When you just so if we can stay on UK for a little bit, Liz Truss, any thoughts on the new prime minister?
Well, she's been very interesting. I think she was in the race for the Conservative Party leadership, and thus the premiership. She was the one who expressed values to a far greater degree than any of her competitors, and as a result appealed to the grassroots of the Conservative Party, who overwhelmingly elected her to the leadership. and I think this is critical because she is trying to get back to the basics, which is smaller government, a more global view. What the energy security, identity security. One of the first things she did was to end the restrictions which her predecessor Boris Johnson put on the exploration for British oil and gas, through both offshore in the North Sea and in the exploitation of the huge shale energy reserves which exist in Britain. That will make a profound difference to whether Britain recovers and progresses economically. There are a few factors which are absolutely critical to sovereignty. One is food security and the ability to produce food surpluses. The other is, of course, the security of water, and the other is the security of energy supply. What we've seen throughout history is that all nations which prosper and empires which prosper do so on the back of an absolutely unrestricted use of energy. Now, you can argue that in this day and age what sort of energy that should be, but the reality is you have to have appropriate energy available at all times to make sure that your society functions, not just to have the lights on and to cook the meal, but to produce what you need to produce, to guarantee safety in the streets through lighting, or the ability to power up forges so that you can build cars, appliances, weapons, all of these things which are the fundamentals of society. So what she's doing there with trying to get British energy security back on track is critical. She then knew that she had to reduce the size of government and to reduce the influence of unelected bureaucrats in determining policy. So she dismissed some of the key civil servants in the Treasury and in other parts of the government, and that will lead to the public, which elected a government, can make sure that the people who are elected actually fulfill the promises that they've made to their electorate and not be thwarted by bureaucrats. And so it was a profound shake-up, and it scared a lot of people in the City of London who are used to a big government, big spending government and the like. So that was a major step forward. And she then moved to ensure that Britain had the lowest corporate tax rate in Europe and among the lowest in the industrialized world. And that will attract a lot more foreign direct investment. It will help ensure that Britain remains key in the international financial community with London as the key financial trading city in the world. So all of these things were immediate and profound. And yes, and she knew, by the way, that this would have a shock effect, as it did. And of course, we saw that at a time when the dollar globally is rising dramatically because there's no other global reserve currency. We saw that was impacting the pound long before she took office. But of course, when she made the great moves with Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng to transform the budget in Britain, that did have an immediate effect, lowering the value of the pound. Pound is still has started to recover immediately. And look, I remember I think it was 1986, the pound was down at $1.06, and at this time it really didn't get down to that level. It got down to about $1.08 and then started moving back up. So look, I'm not worried about the strength of the pound. In fact, it's very good for a period to have a low valued pound so that you can attract people into the country, because it's now cheaper to go on holidays in the United Kingdom, which had become notoriously expensive. It's now becoming affordable to buy properties and assets there. It's a great opportunity, and of course it makes British exports much cheaper on the world market. So all well and good. Sure, you want a strong pound and certainly a stable pound going forward, and I think that's automatically going to happen, and it's going to get stronger. The panic reaction, of course, when Britain left the European Union was that the pound would sink into oblivion and British economy would decline. And of course, all of that was shown to be absolutely, nonsensical fantasy thinking of the pro-Euro people. And at the same time, now that Britain's out of the European Union, the British economy has stabilized. The European Union has continued to decline frighteningly to the point where we see governments or populations, electorates taking control. And for example, in Sweden, electing a conservative government, which says enough of this nonsense. We're not going to continue with this welfare state approach, allowing unlimited migration. The Italians have just done the same thing.
Yeah.
And of course, what does that produce in the media? An absolute panic. We see these claims, we've got far-right government in Sweden, far-right government in Italy. What a lot of nonsense. Because we would be equally justified in saying, well, Germany now has a far-left government, which in some ways it does. But the reality is that we're so becoming accustomed to the lack of objectivity and reasoned thinking within the media that we see these expressions being thrown out. But the reality is that if Europe is to save itself, it will do so by moving away from that incredibly Soviet-styled state control of the states of Europe. And the Italians are quite conscious of that. And in fact, we're seeing the incoming Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, saying, we don't want a United States of Europe. We want a Europe of sovereign United States. In other words, states which are sovereign, but able to work together in harmony with cohesion, trade understandings and the like. The original intention, if you like, of what was originally started out as the European Iron and Coal Community to lower tariffs and the like, and eventually onto the European Community, where you could have freedom of movement and trade, but that didn't mean you lost your identity or your currency, because one of the things that's happening is that most European states are now being hurt dramatically by having the euro as their sole currency, which they don't control. The Greek and Cypriot economies, the Italian economy and so on, all plummeted because Germany was controlling the euro. Well, thank God, in the case of Britain, that Britain opted to retain the pound. And that was the great, if you like, rearguard action of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. So it preserved, if you like, a degree of independent movement. Can you imagine if the United States said, well, this whole idea of kumbaya, I mean, the United States of Europe and the United States of America joining together, and we'll all have the euro as the currency. The United States would then become a small, unimportant power because it wouldn't control its currency. What gives the US economy the resilience it has today is not just that it has resources and innovative people, but it has control of its currency. And if the US dollar ceases to be the global standby currency, then you'll see a period of great economic volatility really hit the United States, far worse than we're seeing now, or we will see over the next year, which is not going to be good.
Now, as the gas prices on the way back up.
Exactly.
I've noticed it's just in the last, I was mentioning this earlier, Gregory Copley, that just in the last few days, it went from 339 to 359 to 379 and 399 this morning. It is just, I don't know where that's going to stop. I'm going to ask you your assessment when we talk about Putin, Russia, and the Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think you have to firstly not read the newspapers or watch the television, because what you're going to get is this bog standard jingoism, whether it's from the Russian side or from the Western side, bearing in mind that this was a crisis which came with the arrival of the Biden government in January 2021. They started saying Russia is going to attack Ukraine. Russia is going to attack Ukraine. They kept building this up. And the Russians saying, what are you talking about? And then, of course, the United States kept talking about, well, we're going to get Ukraine into NATO. We're going to get Ukraine in as part of Western Europe, which was contrary to the promise of Prime Minister Thatcher and President Reagan at the end of the Cold War, where they said, look, the Cold War is over. NATO, which was the great instrument of the West in helping to safeguard against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Treaty Alliance, that's not necessary anymore. And yet what we saw with most presidents after Reagan and after Thatcher in Britain kept pushing NATO into expansion and into expansion right up to the borders of post-Soviet Russia, which was contrary to the understanding and contrary to the necessity, because at that stage, the Russians wanted to be part of the whole Euro-Atlantic trading bloc and were thwarted. And what we see today is that Russia has resigned itself, and did so early this year, resigned itself to the reality that the United States and some of its partners were not going to allow Russia ever to be part of the Western trading system. And they said, okay, then we're on our own and we'll make whatever arrangements are necessary. And I've been warning for some years, having spent the Cold War trying to pry the Soviet Union away from the People's Republic of China, and we did that, starting with the Nixon visit in 1972 or so. We're now pushing Russia back into the arms of the People's Republic of China. And so in the next decade or so, we're going to be trying to find ways to pry them apart again, because what we've seen now is this new Eurasian strategic bloc emerging, and we've yet to see who actually dominates that, whether it'll be Moscow or Beijing. But it's not healthy for the world. It's returned us to Cold War II, which is a bipolar world in a sense, although what we used to call the third world or the non-aligned states, that's now a much larger part of the world, and they don't want to listen either to the Eurasian bloc or to Washington. They feel that they've been pushed around enough, and they are now gaining sufficient sovereignty and independence that they want to make their mind up for themselves as to who they trade with. So we start to see that the sanctions regime, which the United States insisted upon to continue to isolate Russia, is now backfiring and is going to cause Western Europe to be without sufficient energy during this coming winter and possibly through the next year or two, which will mean that a lot of people will suffer and die in Western Europe because they have no access to sufficient energy. And of course, coupled with that, you have the German government, which had been controlling much of Europe through control of the euro, now has fallen into disarray itself. It does have an ultra-left government, which will not allow it to go back to extensive fossil fuel utilization or to nuclear power in order to meet the energy needs of the country over this winter. So they are going to kill a lot of their own people. So, and that's not just in Germany either. This is going to happen throughout Europe. So we've got this situation where we've put ourselves into an extreme conflict. We've forced Russia to become, if you like, the historical fearful power, fearful of encirclement, fear of invaders type of power that it was historically. Now, even though President Putin saw that he had to stop the NATO move against his borders by reoccupying traditional parts of Russia, which had been gradually brought under Ukrainian control during the Soviet period, and he did that with Crimea after 2014, and then, of course, lately the Donbass and related areas, so that they can bring back a huge amount of control over those areas, which give them a lot of industrial capacity, agricultural capacity, and of course, guaranteed dominance over the Black Sea, which is critical for Russia's year-long trading position. Now, even with all of this and the start of the war in February, we saw that with the death of Queen Elizabeth, President Putin sent an incredibly sensitive, personal response to the British people and the British Crown mourning the death of Queen Elizabeth as a great lead individual and someone worthy of admiration and respect, and how President Putin offered his personal wishes to King Charles and the royal family to and going through this period of grief, and how this was a time when we all had to reflect. Now that message was a profound opening for the United Kingdom and the West to start negotiating some kind of end to the Ukraine conflict. It was, look, we've got this period of grief, which we all feel we can talk about it. What happened? The British government rejected that. And this was the fault, I would say, of the bureaucrats there who, and Liz Truss herself has taken on Boris Johnson's anti-Russian xenophobia and is committed to the war by supporting Ukraine and running Ukraine as a proxy war against Russia. So what we saw was that the British government not only ignored that overture by Putin, but then they pointedly said that Russia would not be invited to the funeral of the Queen. They invited the Chinese, and the Chinese sent a senior official and the like.
How does that make sense?
So, and really ask yourself, is Russia the biggest threat we face, or is the People's Republic of China the biggest threat we face? So we missed another opportunity to give Russia an opportunity to break with China or to show a division with China. But we didn't, we rejected that. And at that point, Putin said, well, okay, you've made it quite clear that no matter what we say or do, no matter how we've tried to stop you expanding NATO to literally invade our doorstep, so we're done. I'm now in with this new bloc. So he went to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Samarkand in Uzbekistan, September 15 and 16. And there they all committed to this new Eurasian bloc. And that brought in Turkey. It pulled India away from its alliance with the United States, because the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, was there. And they talked between Xi Jinping, Putin, and Modi about how to ease tensions and how India and China should scale back their mutual hostilities. Well, I have to tell you that if you want to contain Beijing from invading Taiwan, then the one ally you need is India, because India can really overmatch the People's Liberation Army and the Tibetan Plateau and really pull Chinese forces away from an invasion with Taiwan. And yet what do? We've now thrown that whole thing out. And India is now temporizing, as it feels it has to do, with Beijing and Moscow. And Turkey, the supposed NATO ally, has now, which had one foot in each camp, the Eastern and Western camps, has now basically, if you like, still got a foot in both camps, but it's put its weight onto the foot which is in the Eurasian bloc. And this Eurasian bloc, which the most active, aggressive powers in that are Russia, Iran, and the People's Republic of China, are now working in increasing harmony in undermining Western interests or US interests in the Western Hemisphere, particularly South America, the Caribbean, Central America, and Canada. So, we think we can just say, well, one more word out of you and we'll put on some more sanctions. Well, gee, how's that working out for you? The reality is that the US has lost the Western Hemisphere. The United States itself is now encircled, just as we talked about the Western containment of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We're now seeing the Eastern containment of the United States. And nobody seems to even be aware of it.
I'm talking with Gregory Copley, president of the International Strategic Studies Association. Gregory, a couple of things when you're saying about Taiwan, where do you think things are going to go with mainland China and Taiwan?
Well, look, the People's Liberation Army itself, almost as a body, does not want to invade Taiwan. They're being told to be prepared to prepare for it. And indeed, they know that the greatest role of the People's Liberation Army is to project power and to project a posture of certainty, of determination, of moral right and the like. In other words, use their prestige to influence other countries into acting the way that Beijing wants. However, Xi Jinping is in the fight of his life right now. He's coming up to the 20th Party Congress in Beijing in November, and he may or may not be re-elected for that unprecedented third term as General Secretary of the Communist Party. So he is in a war right now to galvanize support. The so-called zero COVID campaign was not about suppressing COVID in China. That's nothing to do with COVID whatsoever. It's about suppressing opposition to him and to stopping people from being able to mobilize in the streets, particularly as they face economic decline, massive economic decline in mainland China today. So he has to suppress his opponents, suppress any insurrection in the street, and he needs to distract the public. Now, some of that distraction of the party and the public could be in initiating military actions against Taiwan. Personally, I think that would be a fatal move for Xi Jinping and for the PRC, and a lot of people inside the Communist Party of China agree with that. But it would be like Lieutenant General Leopoldo Galtieri, the Argentine president, military president, when he knew that the military were about to collapse as a government of Argentina in 1982. What did he do to buy some instant popularity? Because he was an alcoholic and didn't plan ahead, he was very reactive. He went to war to seize the Falkland Islands from Britain in the hope that this would give him sufficient popularity that his government could remain. Well, of course, he picked a target which was going to respond, had much greater strategic depth and capability than Argentina. And of course, the British won and the military was forced out of office in Argentina. So we've got to be aware that Xi Jinping could undertake a Galtieri moment again. And what we're seeing now is the US military, and I'm briefing them on an almost weekly basis, the senior military all know that their big threat is the People's Republic of China, not Russia, because Russia, even if it wished to, doesn't have the global capacity to challenge the United States, whereas the PRC has the economy still to do so, even despite its current collapse. So all of the resources to fight the People's Republic of China from the US point of view are being siphoned away to be given to the Ukrainians to fight Russia in this proxy war. And most of the US military leadership really is unhappy with that because it reduces readiness and warfighting capability in the Pacific. And it does so for the British as well, who have been sending massive amounts of support into Ukraine. And ironically, speaking of General Galtieri in Argentina, the Xi Jinping government has been working with the Argentines to get them to revive their claims on the Falklands, and it's talking about giving them weapons to do that as well. The PRC is getting military bases in the Atlantic. What's this all about? It's not so that the PRC can dominate the Atlantic and South America directly. It's so that the British and the Americans will be forced to move defense assets out of the Indo-Pacific and back into the Atlantic, so that they will be less of a challenge to the People's Liberation Army operations in the Indo-Pacific. So Xi Jinping, in this current battle, it's very volatile in the PRC right now. You might have seen there were talks even in the last couple of weeks that Xi Jinping had returned from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, only to be arrested when he arrived back in Beijing. That was an obvious lie, and it was actually put out by Indian intelligence, who keep getting duped into these kind of things. But the reality is that Xi came back from Samarkand full of new vitality, and he then arrested a whole lot of senior national security officials who he thought could represent a threat. And these were people who had gained their positions in the police organizations and the like during the reign of the previous Jiang Zemin administration. So it's very interesting. This internal civil war goes on and on. And what you've got right now is that the People's Republic of China spends more on internal security than it spends on the People's Liberation Army. So that tells you how much she fears the rise of the Chinese population. And of course, the Chinese population is now in great anger at having lost all of their savings and their retirement security and the like because of the collapse of the property market in the PRC. That's the whole thing is disintegrated. And you've got a situation where, look, the Communist Party is totally aware that the initial revolution or revolt against imperial China began in 1911, 1912, when you had disgruntled rural workers in the cities, unable to find work, revolted and literally brought down the imperial government, particularly with the death of the Empress Dowager. Now, at that time, China was about 5% urbanized. Today, China is, I think, was it 64.7 or 67.4% urbanized. So you've got a lot more disgruntled people in the cities, and they're educated and they're angry. So they're trying to do whatever they can to get their security back. And what's happening is, whilst she is suppressing the population to the maximum degree possible under the guise of zero COVID, he's making sure he doesn't have any enemies in the police force. But he's then throwing out little bits of hope, saying, oh, well, maybe we can find a way to refinance Evergrande and a few of the other big property companies, so that maybe your investment in your apartment which you bought for your retirement is not going to be lost to you, and maybe your life savings haven't all been wasted. But this is just throwing out a little bit of hope before the party congress.
Gregory, I'm going to want to continue the conversation with you, but I know we're close to the top of the hour, but can you, North Korea?
North Korea is, it's a gunpowder state. It's nothing but its power to suppress the population and to basically threaten nuclear conflict. It is a part of it's getting some new vitality out of this new Eurasian power bloc, which Beijing and Moscow and Iran are putting together. But it's on its own, it's not a worry, other than the fact that it has a few nukes to throw around. And of course, we keep panicking about nukes because nuclear weapons are more psychological than real. They're just big bombs.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, but we keep panicking about North Korea. It's
a distraction.
It should be seen in perspective.
It's a distraction.
It is a distraction, but all of these things are psychological, because the whole global fear pandemic, which we've been undergoing for the last few years, is just an example of how modern communications can actually stir within a millisecond a global mass hysteria, a mass psychosis. And whether it's on a COVID, or it's on leftism or rightism or whatever, it's all, we allow ourselves to be blown about in the storm. And when we talk about wars and rumors of wars, let me tell you, rumors of wars are much more dangerous than actual wars.
Wow. I'm talking with Gregory Copley, president of the International Strategic Studies Association, strategicstudies.org. Of course, we've got the links up. I so appreciate you, and I would love to continue, depending on your schedule, the conversation. It's so important. Thanks, mate.
Look forward to seeing you again and talking to your audience, Louis. Thanks, mate.
Thank you. What incredible guy with incredible amount of information. Gregory Copley, again, he's